Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. We are nearing Spooktober, October, the month of the spooky, and so I wanted to get a head start as we get closer to the end of September at the time that I'm talking about this, and just start talking about some spooky literature that I found from my local library. Today's book is all about werewolves and hunting werewolves. I am referring to The Last Werewolf by Glen Duncan, which was published in 2011. For those who don't know, Glen Duncan is an Indian, British, multiracial writer who started writing in the 1990s. As he says, he's known for writing books about the supernatural or love and sex and death, which is something that you see in the story that I'm going to be talking about today. He's written several novels, and including one series, which, as it turns out, that series is part of the book that I'm talking about today. It's the first book in the series that I'm exploring. Didn't really realize that when I picked it out from my local library, but that's just what we've arrived at here. And Glen Duncan has also received some acclaim for his work as well. I don't know too much else about him, as this was another random library read, but I kind of like this, but also I don't really like it at all. So with that said, I'm going to spoil a lot about this book today, but I'm not really going to recommend it. So if you do intend to ever read this, definitely pause this video, go read it, and then come back later. But without further ado, let's talk about The Last Werewolf. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Last Werewolf focuses on the character of Jacob Marlowe. He is a British man who is over 100 years old, because it turns out he is a werewolf who was turned in the 1830s. But it also turns out at the start of the story, we learn that he is the last werewolf alive. As an organization dedicated to hunting down occult things, WOCOP killed the second to last werewolf, and has now begun taunting Jacob as they are going to hunt him down once he turns into a werewolf at the end of the month, and they're going to make a great sport of it. Particularly a man named Granier, who, as it turns out, Jacob killed his father, so he wants to hunt him down. And Granier's assistant, Ellis, also wants to make it part of the sport and truly put an end to all the werewolves that are out there. But Jacob has a friend named Harley, who is an inside man in WOCOP, and is providing him with intel and whatnot to help him escape from various hunters. But Jacob doesn't really want to escape. He seems resigned to his fate, which upsets Harley, but there's nothing really Harley can do about it. We also learn a little bit about Jacob's origins as a werewolf, how he was bitten while camping with his friend in the 1800s, and then he once he turned into a werewolf, he killed his wife, and he later found out that she was pregnant with his child. And he can't ever have a child now because he's a werewolf, and werewolves become sterile. We also learned that he spent the rest of his days so far fighting on the side of good, although he does eat humans from time to time, because again, he's a werewolf. He's fought the Nazis and other fascist groups, and it's also noted that vampires are Nazi collaborators in this story, which is very, very interesting kind of twist on vampires. But hey, somebody had to, collaborate with the Nazis, and in this magical world, it turns out it's the vampires. Granier, on the other hand, is not happy that Jacob is resigned to his fate. So in an effort to taunt him and incite him into a rage, he kills Harley. The organization has always known that Harley was a double agent. But this doesn't make Jacob angry. Instead, he seems content to kill himself. So he heads out to the ocean to do that. But along the way, a mysterious man knocks him out with a tranquilizer dart. And because it's the werewolf time, he transforms while in a prison cell, in a cage. And a woman named Glen Duncan frees him after he transforms back into a human. She notes that she's very interested in finding out the origin of werewolves as a whole. So she has a former archaeologist, a dead archaeologist named Quinn. She has a book that he had that points to a lost city of werewolves and whatnot. And Jacob has spent some time trying to find the city, but he ultimately does not care because, again, he's at the last. He's the last werewolf, and what difference does it make if they find the origin at this point? But as Jacob is trying to leave, he finds out that Jacqueline is actually in league with the vampires who want Jacob because they believe that werewolves have some connection with allowing vampires to tolerate sunlight, and that they want to use Jacob for this. But Jacob doesn't want to help them out because there's a blood feud between werewolves and vampires. But at that point, Granier and Ellis show up in an attack helicopter and gun down most of the vampires. Jacob manages to survive and he flees, but Granier, winks at him to let him know that he's still waiting for the next werewolf cycle in order to hunt him down. Jacob goes to a train station. It's there that he finds a woman named Tallulah, and he senses that she is also a werewolf. That she has, or that she's somehow the last, another werewolf, even though they thought that everyone had died because of or that there couldn't be another werewolf because there's a virus affecting werewolves in this story. And Jacob and Tallulah become close, have a sexual relationship because of the attraction to one another, and he tells her all about this secret world that exists because she's a fairly new werewolf. And they fly to America and proceed to drive across America talking about God and werewolves and both of their past. And Jacob and Tallulah also go on a hunt once they turn into werewolves during this month, and they even kill someone together, which is very beautiful and wholesome. However, when they fly back to Greece, Ellis shows up and kidnaps Tallulah, noting that they'll kill Tallulah unless Jacob helps Ellis. Ellis wants to take full control of Wokop, which means that he wants Jacob to kill Granier on the hunt that's supposed to take place on this next werewolf cycle. Jacob is resistant, but again, he loves Tallulah, so he's willing to do it. And Jacob pulls some strings after vampires attack him and whatnot, and he finally manages to get in contact with Granier and tells him what Ellis has been doing, and Ellis. Granier kills Ellis as a result, but he's also plans to kill Jacob and Tallulah still. But before he can do that, one of Jacob's other vampire-associated friends kills Granier, but Granier manages to get a shot off and kills Jacob in the process. Tallulah is very sad, but we also find out that Tallulah is pregnant, even though werewolves aren't supposed to be able to get pregnant or have children. And as the story comes to a close, she flies to New York and prepares to deal with this big old change of fate that took place, and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is a lot to talk about with this story. It is incredibly flawed. It has a lot of potential, but unfortunately I think the flaws kind of bear it down. But there is still some interesting things that Duncan does with the story. One of the things he talks about is the idea of being a monster, because Jacob sees himself as a monster, rightfully so, throughout this story, ever since he turned into a werewolf. It's been a non-stop kind of monstrous life for him, and it really started with the death of his wife, Arabella, who he deeply loved, but unfortunately when he turned into a werewolf, there was that compelling feel to go and kill and eat Arabella, which he did, and he found out that she was carrying his child not too long after that. So he, in effect, killed two different lives, at least that's what he thinks. Given that he transforms each month, like that feeling of being a monster never really goes away. And to make things more interesting, how Duncan chooses to describe this transformation is very interesting, because it's seen as like there's a twin inside of you. Like when he first transformed into a werewolf, it felt like there was another being created, a more monstrous being that was now a part of you and that you had no real control over. It doesn't really excuse Jacob's behavior because he's still doing this. Like he still feels somewhat in control, although this new twin has taken a lot of the control of the body. And what's also interesting is that Jacob, in some respect, considers this as a punishment from God. Like he feels like he's such a monster that God must be punishing him for something that he did. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. "And for this, for thy wretched arrogance, I have turned thee into a monster. At times I have convinced myself I could hear in the trees' susurrations, and the chuckle of water, and the soft clamor of thin air, the Almighty's condemnation. But the feeling was always displaced by a worse feeling, that where should have been God's booming petulance was in fact a slab of silence the size of the universe. This intimation of the night sky like an abandoned warehouse of stars, of the earth heaving up flora and fauna in epic meaninglessness, was a horror so unexpectedly huge, I turned back to the conviction of God's wrath with a kind of relief. Did he who made the lamb make thee?" And that's really interesting because it gets at this sort of like feeling of being a monster. Did he who made the lamb make thee? Surely like God, like you're such a big monster, like you can't be one of God's creatures or something like that. But there's also a feeling that like this could be God's condemnation of you, but it could also mean that the universe is meaningless and like there is nothing really out there, which I'll get to in a few moments. I do like how Duncan is unapologetic for Jacob's actions. Like he doesn't really try to excuse the behavior. He just presents Jacob and Tallulah as the monsters that they are, and leaves the audience to really deal with those feelings, given that they're supposed to be the protagonist of the story. There is some attempt to make him look good, because again he does call the vampires Nazi collaborators and shows that Jacob is trying to redeem himself by defending those who can't defend themselves throughout history, and like that's supposed to make him look somewhat good. But at the same time, as Jacob says, like that doesn't excuse his behavior. At the end of the day, like one good moral action doesn't cancel out a bad one, and he's still eating people and leaving families broken as a result sometimes. So like Duncan ultimately does not try to excuse any of this behavior, and I have to admire that from the story. Duncan is also talking about God and meaning in this story, which I really like. That's not something you really see in these types of stories, except, of course, maybe Frankenstein, but that's a whole other perspective of God there. Jacob questions the existence of God throughout the story, wondering if there's something out there, if God's possibly punishing him, or if there is no God, if this is all just a meaningless sort of like event in the ultimate history of the universe. Because like werewolves can be seen as God's punishment, that maybe werewolves as a whole did something to wrong God, and now they got the short end of the stick in terms of the mythological being power-ups and whatnot, because it's surprisingly easy to kill werewolves. But you could also see this as a punishment for Jacob's actions. Like he notes that he and Arabella lived in sin, that they were having a big sexual relationship before they got married, and they were very much in lust and love with one another, and like this could have been an affront to God's way. Like you're supposed to live a life of chastity or purity or whatnot, and here's Jacob defying that, and so God is punishing him as a result. I don't think Jacob truly believes that, but there's an argument to be made that he like that could be something that might have happened if a higher power even exists. There's also a mention of the myth of Lycaon, where Zeus punished Lycaon to be a werewolf for his actions, and so again another sort of implication that this is a divine power of transforming someone for their many wrongs. But again, as I mentioned, like Jacob does feel that maybe the opposite is true, that this is all sort of some sick cosmic joke, that the universe is silent to the suffering of both Tallulah and Jacob, and that there's there's ultimately no meaning to any of this, that it's all human suffering, that this is just the way of the universe, and there's nothing you can do about it, that it's a waste of time to even ascribe meaning to any of this. And so, when he takes a life, maybe that doesn't mean anything at all. And you can get away with quite a bit if you actually believe something like that, which again, I don't think Jacob truly believes one way or another here. But given, meaning and whatnot, you also have an important question of existentialism, like sort of like helping your species carry on. And there is that existential need to have a child for Jacob in this story, because he, of course, his wife dies and he loses the only child he can really have. There's the talk of the werewolves being sterile and him being the last werewolf. There won't be any more after he dies, presumably. And then the idea of Tallulah coming along and providing hope for the species and its proliferation, and then her also getting pregnant and whatever that could mean. And then you see the comparison of werewolves and vampires, how neither of them can really continue their species, and they rely on biting others to really create more of them, and what all that could really mean. So there's a lot of discussion of proliferation, existentialism, God, and meaning in this story. But what's unfortunate is there's a lot of potential for this, but it never really goes anywhere, because the question of whether or not there is a God is never really addressed by the end of the story. It's just kind of an idea floated by Duncan, and then he just sort of moves on. It's just kind of the thought process of Jacob throughout the story. I think Duncan could have done a little bit more to offer maybe guidance or a better understanding of what exactly he's trying to get at here. There are some other things that I do like about the story. I do feel that it's wonderfully carnal and violent at times. Plenty of violence, plenty of instances of werewolves chomping on human beings, and being an incredibly dark kind of portrayal, almost gothic in a way. And then there's a whole bunch of talk about sex, which Duncan even notes, is a big factor of the stories that he writes. Love and sex, and he's not afraid to shy away from it, but it does get a bit obsessive at times, which I'll note in a few moments. And then I also like how he kind of builds on the idea of the wandering immortal, someone who is gifted or cursed with long life and is now wandering through the world and is both, impacted in some way, but also can no longer relate to these people because he's so old and he's seen so much and he's so changed. And so it's kind of like Dr. Manhattan in the Watchmen series, although not nearly as well written or well structured in that way. But I do like how Duncan makes use of the wandering immortal trope. As I mentioned before, the story is carnal, but it also feels a bit sexist, as all the women characters in the story seem like their only value is to have sexed with, or to be sexed, or to have a potential for having children. Because with Arabella, like you saw that her greatest value was having sex with Jacob, and then potentially having a child. And it seems like the reason we're supposed to be sad is because she was there was potential for her to have Jacob's child. Like that's the primary focus there. And then you have Tallulah, who is supposedly yet another werewolf who could affect the plot, but at near the end of the story, she's kind of taken out of it and made to be ineffective and just held captive so that the men can do their thing. And then at the end of the story, she's pregnant, and we find out that she's having a child. So again, it does feel a bit sexist, and because the other female characters are either killed or they're prostitutes. So there seems to be limited use for women in these stories. Given this is the only book by Duncan that I've read, but I have a feeling this might be a theme of his other stories if it shows so prevalently here. And then there's other problems that I have with the plot in this story. There does feel like a sense of non-urgency, even though Duncan tells us that several times that it is urgent. Like there's sort of a counter message there, because although Jacob is being hunted by Grainier, Grainier doesn't show up all that often. He's kind of distant, and we're told that the werewolf or the vampires are also searching for Jacob, but again, they don't show up until they're needed. So there's never really a threat of being followed. They're like Jacob and Tallulah are just allowed to drive across America for what seems like 50 or so pages, and it feels like, is this an urgent story? Is there urgency here or not? I feel like Duncan isn't really clear in that, and it really impacts the plot, because a sense of urgency could give us more stakes here. Like, it could make us see like, oh, something needs to be done, rather than just kind of wallowing about God and meaning and traveling across the country. And then I think because of that, the plot threads are dampened, because so little happens over so many pages. It just feels like any sense of plot is lost, or it feels like it's meandering at times. And also, the problem is that Duncan doesn't really have an idea of what he wants to talk about. He brings up new ideas every so often, like every 50 pages. At first you think, oh, this is going to be a showdown between Grainier, whose father died at the hands of Jacob, and Jacob. Like, that'd be a wonderful idea for a story, but Grainier just hides in the shadows for most of the story. And you think this is also going to be a tale of running from vampires, but even the vampires seem ineffective in this story and are only show up periodically. And you think, oh, this is going to be a story about the last two werewolves, or a new werewolf and encountering the world that Jacob already lives in. And it doesn't really feel like it's that either. He introduces all these ideas, all wonderful sort of plot threads that could create a very lively and very fantastic story, and really does nothing with them. I feel like the biggest problem with the story is its wasted potential, unfortunately. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Last Werewolf by Glen Duncan. As I mentioned, it's a story with a lot of potential, but ultimately it fails, and what you're left with is a story that has interesting themes, but nothing to really go along with it, and you end up with a sort of hack or like half-baked story that left me at least a bit disappointed. So I'm not going to recommend it to you out there, although it is an interesting way to start off the spooky season. So if you're looking for something spooky, maybe check this out from your local library. If you have any thoughts on what I said here, you want to have a conversation, comment below. I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book or this author if they don't already know. Also, join the Discord if you want to have a conversation about books, movies, or whatnot, other forms of media. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and beastly travels. Farewell.